was meeting with some young organizers last night, and I asked them, what do you want to know about decolonization? And one of them said, what are the concrete tools that have not been used by colonizers that we can use to move in new directions, to have new ways of being? Or as you say in one of your books, The Purpose Gap, to build a new world, a
That's
world
right.
without the colonization and domination.
It's a great question. I think one of the things that I'm blessed with a family that's multicultural, multi-religious. I mean, we check all the boxes on the census together. And part of at least my approach to decolonization, I'm not a purist. I'm not a decolonizing purist. We're going to get back to some pure state. I don't believe that there is ever such a pure thing that there is such thing as a clean dollar. There's not. Mm-hmm. So for me, if I'm not working from a pure space, I'm working from this broken world that we all are inhabiting together. There isn't a pure tool that will take us to that next thing. In fact, if you're looking for that pure tool, you're doomed to fail. So what we're trying to do is really say, what are the tools, capacities, and coalitions that we need to build across different communities and traditions for us to reimagine that world. So, a concrete example of this would be when folks were back home, some elders had passed away. These are folks who, where I grew up in Salinas, California, which is an agricultural space, which I write a lot about. The people I went to high school with, it's not just the folks who work the fields, it's also folks who own the fields. And one of the kids I went to school with, the owner. I mean, he represents the worst of colonization in both his body and his history. He's not a nice guy. I mean, I've known him for a really long time, but he called me up knowing I'm the religious folk, asking me to do some work with him around the loss of his family members, elder family members. And part of the work then is to imagine what is it that I uniquely bring that can help reshape so that way his descendants don't damage my descendants in this moment where we're uniquely put together in a conversation where he is deeply vulnerable. How do we do this? And part of that is taking him through ritual and tradition, inviting him into a practice. And when I'm working on the front lines with folks who are in direct opposition to these systems, who are not, kind of butted up against the powers that be, that are really trying to change them, protesting, that sort of thing, that sense of healing, touch is still needed. People are broken, they're dying. And so for me, it really has been about how do we offer the best of these gifts that my grandmother taught me, that's just the gifts of presence and love and some sacred traditions that I think would be helpful for the rest of the world. And I think for young organizers, doing a deep dive, looking for those traditions that are unique to you. And in those cases where you can't find that pure thing, reimagine what that might be.
One of the young organizers was saying, my people are the colonizers. I mean, if you're going back to roots, those are my roots. So if I get rid of that, what do I got left?
That's right.
How do we not only decolonize systems, but folks' souls?
100%.
How do we do that work?
We wouldn't be the first to ask or answer that question, even in the written stuff. I mean, Memi wrote about, the colonizer and the colonized, famous book where he's wrestling with that dichotomy. We're both and. There is no such thing as a pure. David Truer's work, I think, is fantastic around this and the indigenous kind of worldview that, conflict has been around since the beginning of time. This is not a new thing. What we're living into is the set of conditions we were born into. So what are we going to do in this moment to be different? And I do think that is going to require a level of creativity for this generation to say, what are the things we can recover, reclaim, reimagine for a future self, knowing that that's still not going to be a perfect thing, but that's our task. Yeah.
That fits in. One of the young organizers was saying, aren't we all colonizers? I mean, if we live in this country, in this culture, in these systems, aren't we all participating in the perpetuation of colonization?
Yeah.
And I was struck by, in your first book, Nobody Cries When We Die, you talk about they slay us in the classroom as quickly as we are slain on our streets. How do we begin to unmask our colonial thinking, to undo the very way we interpret the world around us or think about things that come towards us? How do we begin that work? What keeps us on that path?
When I was organizing with Interfaith Worker Justice, I got I had a great opportunity. One of my co-organizers was the principal organizer for Howard Zinn's final lecture. So we got to spend a little bit of time with someone like Howard Zinn, thinking about what do we do with history. And the example that I always love some of that he gave in that final lecture was that every war is a war on children was kind of his mantra. Like every war, regardless of who's right or wrong or why we're fighting it, does damage, does some trauma to that next generation who has to carry the memory of the loss of their family members. And what does that mean to try to reheal and reimagine that? And I think about my own sort of unmasking of what I had to unlearn. I think about the way that we teach history, the way we tell our communal storytelling in this country that, manifest destiny, that, U.S. moved from the East Coast to the West. Well, my people have been out here for a really long time. Like it wasn't empty. We were here. And I think about even when we tell our own story around, there's a great book called The Fifth Son that writes about when the Spanish arrived, how the story we're told in school is that, Montezuma, who's sitting there seeing these and interpreting these white colonial settlers coming in as gods, and that all the people just kind of said, oh, yeah, of course this is coming. And the historical record does not support that. Instead, it shows that some of the people in my own lineage actually took up arms. They didn't see that. It was a bunch of folks who were trying to make a political or a survival move to say, how are we going to survive these folks who have weapons that can kill us, that are giving us disease? How do we navigate this politically and socially and actually strategize around this? It wasn't just they're gods. I'm not the descendant of people who didn't know the difference of their traditions and what these humans are as gods. I actually am descendants of warriors, people who saw this moment and were trying to navigate it so that way I could live, so that future Patrick could be in existence. And I think undoing those types of myths and telling new stories or stories that have been erased or not told correctly, that's the work that we can do. And I think it heals for future generations.